Hello everyone and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers and with me as ever in the studio we have Spiked editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us this week we have Head of Policy at MCC Brussels and an Associate Fellow of the Academy of Ideas, Jacob Reynolds.
No, thanks for having me.
Coming up on today's show, the French farmers' siege of Paris, the tartan tyranny of Nicola Sturgeon and the right-wing paranoia over Taylor Swift. Now, if you're watching us on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe and click the bell because it really helps the channel. And if you're listening to us on audio, then just make sure you subscribe using your favourite podcast app. So for the best part of this week, French farmers have been engaged in what they're calling the siege of Paris. They've encircled the capital city, blocking all of the key motorways. And although there are many specific demands in France, it's quite clear that this is part of a Europe-wide revolt of farmers, of people who work in agriculture, and also various other kind of more material industries. Jacob, I mean, you'll have seen some of these people in Brussels as well. Tom and I have met with farmers in Berlin. It's happened in Holland. It's happened in Ireland. What do you think ties all these farmers' protests together? Why are they all so angry? Why is it kicking off everywhere?
Yeah, I think there's 3 points to make on this. The first, as you say rightly, is that this is has already turned into a pan-European movement. And the reason for that, which is the second point, is that there's something that ties all these policies together. And that's the environmental agenda of the EU, to put it in a nutshell. Whether it's the increasingly stringent rules on all kinds of agricultural emissions, most importantly being nitrates or nitrogen, or set-aside policies, or even something that's beginning to emerge, which is the way, and lots of farmers that we've been speaking to right across Europe have really picked up on this, is that farmers are increasingly being made to they're being used to balance the books in environmental terms. So whether it's forcing them to set aside land, which can then be traded as a carbon credit for, say, a chemicals factory, so the chemical factory can carry on producing. But farmers are beginning to work out that policies emanating from the European Union, which are being enforced dutifully, although differently in different European countries, but they are being kind of made the scapegoats so that the EU can reach its environmental targets and its net zero targets. And that means for them, quite simply, the end of their agriculture as they know it. And this has a special effect on smaller farms who are not able to comply with the stringent regulations, the reporting requirements, all these kind of things. So the thing that really unites us right across Europe is the rubber hitting the road of the green agenda.
Yeah. And Tom, I mean, there is this sense that these things are simply being imposed from on high, whether that's from Brussels or from Berlin or Paris. You know, a bureaucrat comes up with a target that says, say, like the EU's farm to fork strategy says, you've got to use 50% fewer pesticides or 10% fewer fertilizers. That doesn't, when that actually has to be implemented at the farm level, I mean, it's madness. It just doesn't work. But it seems to work in the bureaucrat's head.
I think that's exactly it. And when you speak to some of these farmers, that's one thing that they'll say very quickly is that they have no idea what they're talking about. They're coming up with these rules in Brussels or Berlin or Paris or whatever with no understanding of what's feasible. Often you'll hear complaints about it's a different rule every week. It's this kind of sense that they're constantly on the receiving end of these regulations. And I think it's no surprise that it's been the people who are actually essentially at the forefront of agriculture or industry or haulage or what have you, who have been the first to revolt against this, because obviously things like high energy prices or, you know, policies which impact upon the food supply and so on are going to be felt across society, but these are the people who feel it most keenly. It's obviously going to hit them in the pocket. They understand this stuff is nonsense and it doesn't work. And there's obviously a big contrast, particularly between people who work in the cities who aren't going to, outside of generally high energy prices, they aren't going to necessarily experience or recognise the full absurdity of the green agenda than people who actually work in it. But I'm also very struck by how there is this pan-European farmers movement, which, as Jacob was outlining there, has a lot to do with EU regulation, but how there's also a kind of broader revolts going on in these industries across the West more broadly. And you see them very clearly in conversation with one another. And I think that you could apply that easily to the truckers' protests in Canada. There was a similar kernel where you have rules being imposed from on high and a sense that you can't push us around like this anymore, and that being pushed back in the term of COVID mandates in that instance. I think the Gilets jaunes were an early manifestation of this. People living outside of the cities in the suburbs and the peripheries who rely on their cars but are being hit by punishing green taxes, just saying they're not willing to put up with it anymore. And I think that's something that's really fascinating, not least because of the fact that they are really clearly in conversation with one another.
Yeah.
You see that with the farmers across Europe, but you also see it between these different revolts as well. So I think it's really interesting, it's really inspiring, and long may it continue, frankly.
Definitely. And Jacob, I think it's fair to say that the elites are also in conversation with each other across the world, or maybe they're not. Maybe it's a sign of cluelessness. But the reaction is always the same: is to say that they're fascists. What are they complaining about? What's wrong with them? Don't they understand how important the green agenda is?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is the point about them being kind of the farmers and the truckers, whatever, being forced to kind of become the foot soldiers for the green movement, even though they don't want to be, and now they're kicking back against this. And that's why what's going on has a real populist quality to it. People understand instinctively, people out there protesting or blocking roads understand that it's them, and they have wide support, as we know, amongst large sections of society in Germany and in Belgium, in France, everywhere, that they have a wide sense of support, because this is a populist kind of revolt against policies of the elites. And the elites' response, as you say, is always to double down, always to say that it's probably the Russians organising it, or it's fascism, or whatever it is. There was a particularly interesting example in Brussels where, so the farmers set up camp today outside the European Parliament, and immediately, and there were tweets from this guy who runs the kind of LGBT NGO, and he took a picture of a fire. He'd clearly never been to anything resembling a protest before. Took a picture of a fire and was like, "This is our January 6th moment. They're about to come and get us." And it's like, and that kind of, it really, they're on the one hand clueless about the policies, but on the other hand, they're desperate for this kind of valor of presenting themselves as bravely defending a kind of special agenda, the green democratic agenda, as they would like to see it, against those kind of uneducated, ill-informed, selfish people who won't simply give up their livelihood so that the EU can meet its targets.
And Tom, one of the slogans that keeps coming up is "No farmers, no food." I mean, do you get the sense that the sort of laptop class, if you like, have just forgotten how important the material economy is, how important
I think that's exactly it. And as we've been talking about, there's one thing that connects a lot of these industries, which is the fact that these are people, the people who are in protest, whether that's the truckers or the farmers or whoever, they know where the food comes from, they know how the energy is produced, they know how the goods get from A to B, and they know that you cannot do any of those things if you follow this agenda that's being hammered on them by the elites. And I think they're also, by parking their tractors on the elite's lawn, as it were, demonstrating that they are actually very essential to how society functions. You don't want to get on the wrong side of people who operate heavy machinery, but also if they don't show up to work tomorrow, it has a big impact. Yeah. If half of the French government did show up tomorrow, no one would probably notice. So this is something which is being really asserted by these movements, and I think characterising them as a populist movement is very crucial. There's something that reminds me a lot of Brexit and various electoral populist revolts we've seen in recent years, not because they're far right or extreme as the people are trying to demonise them as being, but because of the fact that its social base seems to be very similar. You seem to have, across these different protests, and also the support that they're getting from the public, a kind of coming together of working class and kind of lower middle class small business people who share a couple of clear things in common, one of which is that they're really on the sharp end of the economic price of a lot of these green policies, either because they haven't got much money to begin with, or because their business is directly impacted, and if not decimated, by a lot of these policies. But they also share a cultural condescension that is heaped upon them by the elites, either because they're being dismissed as far right and fascist and so on, or because they're just generally seen as kind of inelegant yokels who are probably just moaning about nothing, and whose issues are just not particularly interesting to the elites and to politicians, even though they're fundamental to how society feeds itself, powers itself, runs, and so on. So I think you're really seeing a kind of clear constituency emerge, and it's that social base that we've seen being behind populism across Europe and the West time and time again in recent years.
Definitely. Jacob, briefly, before we move on, I just wanted to talk a bit about some news that came out from Brussels. There's been this sort of plan being discussed at quite a high EU level, talking about how they could possibly wreck the Hungarian economy, because Hungary is obviously seen as a country that doesn't quite toe the line on a lot of EU issues. It has quite a populist government. I mean, what have you made of that?
Yeah, well, essentially, I mean, the trigger for this is Hungary's reluctance, or until today, their reluctance to commit to extra funds for Ukraine. But you don't have to take any position on Ukraine at all to understand the issue at stake, which is that Hungary is increasingly made into a kind of scapegoat for not, as you say, towing the line on a whole range of issues, from immigration to gender ideology and all the rest of it. And this leaked memo, which very kind of quickly backfired and exposed, in a way, the cluelessness of the elites who run the European Union, thinking that they could kind of talk down the Hungarian economy when, broadly speaking, the fundamentals of the economy are quite strong and all the rest of it. EU money is obviously important and necessary for certain elements of Hungarian society, but they can't just kind of tank the Hungarian economy. But actually it really backfired because they kind of went well beyond their mandate, and it exposes what is the way that the EU is transforming itself, which is not a kind of, if it ever was, a kind of genuine community of nations as the rhetoric would have it, and a kind of coming together of people across Europe for some kind of shared future. Instead, it's increasingly a top-down, led right from the centre organisation that tries to use economic blackmail to make countries toe the line. And that's why it was important that this thing was leaked, and then, but more importantly, that it really backfired. And I think it exposes the way, as I say, that the EU has moved beyond kind of consensus politics and really seeks to demonise and stigmatise and blackmail countries that aren't prepared to go along with whatever the latest fashion of EU elites is.
So Nicola Sturgeon appeared before the UK COVID inquiry this week, and it seems to have finally almost dawned on the commentariat that she's not actually a saint in the way that they seem to believe. So there's been a couple of quite significant accusations held at her. She's been accused, and she's admitted actually to deleting pretty much all of her WhatsApps from her time in office during the pandemic. Despite the fact that she said when the inquiry was announced that she wanted to be fully transparent, she's been accused of buying burner phones or allowing staff to use burner phones paid for with Scottish Government expenses, again to wriggle out of having the messages read. And maybe most significantly, she's been accused, and I think this is a pretty fair accusation, of politicising the pandemic, of using it as a sort of platform to push for Scottish independence. Tom, what have you made of this and the sort of unravelling of Sturgeon?
Like you, I'm struck by the fact that it's this week, that it's these set of accusations which have made everyone realise that maybe she's not the most wonderful human being who ever existed, that it was her kind of admitting. And yes, it was very shady and embarrassing, and she was caught out on a lie effectively, which is something which is always going to make people reappraise this individual who they built up as being so wonderful. But if you think about all the other things she's been responsible for in recent years, if you think about the ongoing criminal investigation into her and her husband about the alleged misuse of party funds, if you think about all of the various kind of internal scandal that they had over the Alex Salmond allegations and the allegation from him that the SNP, led by Nicola Sturgeon, were launching effectively a witch hunt against him, which, if nothing else, even if you don't believe the full extent of those claims, the very clear way in which the offices of the Scottish state were used to try and suppress some of his evidence being put before MPs, all of these things were very, very shady. So you've got that. You've got some of the policies she's been responsible for, which long before COVID were insanely authoritarian. You know, the named person scheme wasn't something she came up with, but certainly was something that she cheerleaded, assigning a state guardian to every child. This is really sinister stuff. Even that Supreme Court case where her plan to hold an unconstitutional referendum on breaking up the United Kingdom was something that just came and went without much discussion. Even though when Boris Johnson tried to prorogue Parliament for a couple of extra days, people talked about it as if it was our January 6th moment. So this is the complete disparity between the things that she's actually been caught doing and in some cases knocked back and punished for doing, just never really registered. And obviously on the one hand, that's just double standards. People like her or agree with her or like the fact that she gives it to the Tories and therefore she gets a free pass on certain issues. But I think it's also a reminder that a lot of the things that they've gotten very hysterical about in recent years, when the government does it, when they start calling the Tories authoritarian and fascist and so on, the Scottish government have sort of pioneered with the SNP a kind of form of authoritarianism which is really stark, really extreme, and as I say, goes well beyond COVID. And yet, because they like it, because they agree with it, because it's going to clamp down on views that they dislike, or it's going to meddle in the lifestyles of people that they don't much care for or whatever, they've just been fine with it. So yeah, it's interesting that it's this that it's unravelling about, but it wasn't any of the other scandals or any of the other insane policies that she actually implemented. It's
worth saying with this the named person scheme, it was struck down by the Supreme Court as being in breach of human rights. Now, supposedly that's the worst crime the worst thing you can do in society today. I mean, it was a really draconian policy. I mean, the idea would be that you'd literally have people from the state finding out, you know, how kids' bedrooms were decorated, were they consulted on what TV programs, you know, they're allowed to watch, to find out if their parents are abusing them, essentially. I mean, it's just completely mad. Jacob, one thing that has obviously, this being the COVID inquiry, it has led a lot of people maybe to reassess Nicola Sturgeon's pandemic performance. It seemed as if every time, you know, she took every opportunity to be just that bit more authoritarian than Johnson, which is quite incredible considering how authoritarian the English lockdowns were.
Yeah, well, I think in a way you might see this as slightly a kind of a way of letting off the hook some people for subscribing to and supporting what were her increasingly draconian measures, and the revelations that you've talked about in terms of how she deliberately sought to politicize their response to the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is a political matter, so there's nothing wrong with some politics being involved, but the way that she tried to constantly distinguish herself from and use it as a grandstanding attempt to say that, oh, we're the ones that take health seriously. It's the nasty people in Westminster and nasty Boris Johnson who doesn't care about people's health, and we're kind of the good and the moral and the virtuous ones because we're going to do extra clampdowns whenever you see. And that very deliberate policy has really been exposed. And in a way, there is this element, I think, of people looking back on that and thinking maybe we shouldn't have gone along with some of this. Maybe it was all a bit too far. And she's kind of like, this has become the issue that she's tripped up on. And it is worth saying that the details that you've outlined in terms of burner phones, it's like something from like a kind of post-war small corrupt European country rather than like a kind of 21st century country. And there's this kind of mafia element to the way that the SNP operates, which I think, as much as you're right, Tom, that obviously that you could have pinned a lot of scandals on her in the past. It's like when it's so obvious and so blatant, the kind of this kind of clan-like mafia behavior of the SNP really stands exposed. And I mean, in a way, sadly, this issue, Nicola Sturgeon will take the fall for it to some degree, and the broader kind of structure of SNP power in Scotland remains largely unchallenged. Sure, Labour might make up some seats in the next election in Scotland, but the way that Scotland has turned into this kind of semi-autonomous, as I say, mafia-style state is like that we really need to get to grips with.
And Labour obviously agrees with every authoritarian measure that the SNP has put forward. Tom, I mean, certainly Nicola Sturgeon represents, I think, it's fair to say, a style of leader that we've come to know and love, or not love so much. You kind of put her in the same category I would as Jacinda Ardern or
Trudeau.
Justin Trudeau. This kind of liberal, strong person.
Liberal strong man, liberal strong woman, and not so liberal as it turns out. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's clearly those leaders are kind of in conversation with one another. There's a whole range of issues which needn't be related yet are for some reason, and that you see repeatedly kind of leapt upon by each of these leaders. I mean, the fact that, for instance, the Scottish National Party, which, you know, allegedly its aim is to break up the United Kingdom, the fact that the thing that brought one of its most successful leaders down was because she was determined to put rapists in women's prisons. It's a really striking kind of fact that there is an array of elite issues which they are really preoccupied with. They will push it through by any means necessary, and yet they're things which are deeply unpopular, authoritarian, damaging. And we see that kind of across the piece. And also inability to recognise how authoritarian or just demented a lot of these policies are on the part of the commentariat, who treat all of those three figures certainly as if they are kind of earthbound saints, like they're wonderful. How could you possibly dislike them, even though what they're doing is incredibly damaging and are often carrying on in an incredibly authoritarian, if not corrupt fashion. So it's been fascinating how the halo of these sorts of policies, how that seems to mean that no one wants to criticise them in the mainstream media, but also just how similar the agenda is of a lot of these different political parties, which, yes, are generally seen as kind of centre-left-ish, whatever that means these days. But there's no reason why, certainly in a historical sense, they'd be so attached to all of these things, particularly if they're supposedly liberal left, as they're often characterised. Yeah, I
mean, they're all very hardline on lockdown, all very into the trans issue, of course, and all very into green stuff. I mean, that seems to be one of the big overarching things, which is especially interesting in the case of the SNP, because the case for Scottish independence for so long was built on the idea that there's all this oil wealth that is going to, the United Kingdom and could be Scotland's. But now, by the time Nicola Sturgeon left, the SNP policy was actually, we don't want to dig any more oil out of the North Sea. So they even contradict their own sort of founding principles for these newer kind of elite ideals.
Yeah, it's very right, Tom, to point out the way that lots of these people have kind of become undone in a similar time. I mean, like Trudeau's still going, but you might kind of add Angela Merkel into the mix a little bit in the way that someone who always kind of presented the right image, but actually when you scratch the surface of there wasn't kind of much of political substance there, and this strange left liberal identification with somebody who's kind of, it is almost like a reflection of the Blair era. They're kind of good enough on camera. They like say some of the right things. They know how to word things, but actually they haven't got any answers to any of the problems that are facing their country at a fundamental level. The SNP's kind of the failed case for independence being a good case in point. No kind of vision of what Scotland might look like independent, other than kind of not the rest of the UK. And so they've all become undone because they don't have anything of substance to them, really. And I think so. I mean, it's good we can celebrate these things coming undone. We need a little bit more of the active pushback, because we can't just always rely on the fact that the elites will end up floundering in their own kind of incompetence. But so we need a little bit more of the pushback, but we can welcome that they're kind of falling from grace.
It is interesting as well how, in a sense, it shows how easily impressed the media are, or at least how focused on quite superficial things they are, because I think Merkel's another good example, sort of centre-right, but still very much that kind of centrist establishment. Was seen as so wonderful for so long. And now, in the space of months, her entire reputation as like the greatest post-war leader that Europe has ever had is completely unravelled, because not only did she pursue a lot of policies which were mad and damaging, but of course a lot of the people who ended up writing a political obituary agree with all of those things. But she was also just incredibly inept. I mean, she sorted up all of these tremendous social and economic problems for Germany, which are now coming home to roost. So a lot of these people, are, as well as being wrong uns, are really rubbish as well. But just because of the fact that they sounded the right notes, or they looked a certain way, or they were young and fresh and interesting, or just drop dead gorgeous, and just in Trudeau's case, they thought they were the dog's bollocks. Like they are. They say populist voters, they're just won over by Trump or Boris being a bit funny or whatever, but I think they are much more vapid.
Right, so Taylor Swift, is she a government psyop? Incredibly, this is a question that has consumed a lot of the sort of right-wing influencer sphere for the past week or so, and for some people even longer. A lot of Republicans are worried that Taylor Swift might give her presidential endorsement to Joe Biden, and then is that the end game for Trump, is their kind of thinking. And with Swift sort of being a country star, maybe she's been got at, is, I guess, the theory. There are some even wilder variations on that. Some people say she's done a deal with George and Alex Soros as part of a plot to install Gavin Newsom in the White House. Other people managed to tag that into the COVID vaccines, because her boyfriend, the NFL footballer, has once did an advert for Pfizer. Tom, what have you made of this? I assume you don't agree that it is a government psyop.
No, I wouldn't dismiss it out of that. No, it's very funny, and it's also sometimes I can't work out whether some of this is semi-tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of it really isn't, and I find that really fascinating. Aside from the conspiratorial currents which run in parts of that politics, there's also just a preoccupation with celebrity, because of the fact that these people spend a lot of the time in the media, online, not out in the real world, touching grass, as people would say. And so they become really preoccupied with, again, sort of celebrities and things of this nature. And that was something which, in a funny way, kind of mirrors what particularly has happened in recent years with celebrities, where you have the left, and the woke left in particular, desperate to claim these individuals, and actually getting very frustrated when these individuals don't toe the line on feminism or LGBT or Israel, or whatever it might be the issue of the day. Taylor Swift, funnily enough, was the focus for a lot of that rage for years, because of the fact that she seemed to adopt a kind of apolitical approach for many years. That kind of Michael Jordan, Republicans buy sneakers as well. Sort of that seemed to be a kind of guiding ethic. She kept out of politics. She obviously had this sort of Nashville background, as I understand, so therefore you can understand why you wouldn't want to alienate that section of your audience. But there was just these constant think pieces, like, when is Taylor Swift going to say something about feminism? When is Taylor Swift going to say something about Me Too?
When will she say something about Gaza?
That was a recent, a recent flurry of that stuff. When is she going to denounce Trump? That was a big one. Allegations that she was almost like a sort of alt-right pin-up was a thing a few years ago. So it's like the mirror image of that nonsense, And I think you have a similar dynamic, which is there's sections of the very online right, not least because they are very online, who are quite detached from ordinary concerns. It's why they can jump on culture war issues and almost distort them into something so over the top and extreme that they make it look ridiculous. They make the rest of us look bad who are into those issues, if you see what I mean. So I think there's a similarity in, because though some of these individuals are quite detached from the communities that they think they're speaking on behalf of, they can become really obsessed with celebrities and people who they see as being their conduit to ordinary people. And I think this is probably a symptom of that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, because, you know, at the end of the day, what celebrities think it doesn't actually impact that much on the average voter. I mean, you think about Trump's election in 2016, you know, it had none of the celebrities, all of the celebrities lined up behind Hillary Clinton. And what good did that do her?
Yeah, well, I mean, conspiracy theories often come in a way from a perceived place of weakness. And like the fact that all these people are hyperventilating about the fact that Taylor Swift's going to swing the election in the other way is kind of bizarre, because it speaks to their complete, not just their lack of faith, but their lack of connection to the people who they say they share politics with, the kind of broad swathe of American people. But the irony of that is that by kind of casting themselves in the role of victims, in the role of those who are going to be done to by global conspiratorial powers, they miss the real weakness, which is the weakness of the elites, who are desperate to claim someone like Taylor Swift for their own, as you said. There's similar things happened among some European politicians who were like, if only I can get a photo op with Taylor Swift. And so,
don't they want her to encourage people to vote in the European elections?
But the elite, because they know they have no connection at all to anyone, they're casting around for anyone who might represent something. They don't know what it is, but like, all right, if only we can get Taylor Swift on our side, then it's all done. So by this kind of very online right, who are obsessed with images, become kind of transfixed by social media, they've lost any connection at all to any kind of political power, because they don't have a connection with people.
Definitely. And Tom, do you think there's a sort of danger in this kind of growing paranoia? Because it is, you know, it is irrational to obsess over Taylor Swift, and it's not nobodies who we're talking about. I mean, some of the people are like Jack Posobiec, very influential conservative commentator. Rolling Stone magazine has said that actual, you know, Trump aides are worried about Taylor Swift, and they have this strange quote where they're potentially going to declare holy war on her. Similarly, you know, the rise of conspiracy theories, it seems to have become a lot more mainstream on the US right. Certainly, you know, an obsession with the COVID vaccines. This is somehow related to the Taylor Swift story. There was a woman on One American News Network who deliberately, you know, conflated what she called the COVID death shots with Taylor Swift's boyfriend. I mean, it just...
Yeah, we know these characters exist. I suppose the question is kind of how
much does it matter?
How much does it matter? I think what is clear, though, is I think that particularly for people who claim to be involved in sort of populism, I think conspiracy thinking, conspiratorialism is a complete dead end. If anything, it's the antithesis of what populism is supposed to be about, which is the idea that ordinary people should have more sway, that what people want they should get, that we should make democracy more real and deeper and so on. Whereas all the conspiratorial thinking is about how there's this plot against us, you know, what you think is true is actually bollocks, you know, all of these kind of tropes about sheeple and so on. It's a really undemocratic, anti-democratic sort of way of looking at the world, is that people are just being hoodwinked and they don't even realise it. So that's clearly a dead end. I think it's also just a dead end engaging in just this obsession with celebrity and social media as we're sort of talking about it. I mean, the people who put Trump into office, the people who got Brexit over the line, are people who don't have the luxury of being on their phones all day. And I think that fundamental kind of disconnect is one of the things that certainly tripped the sort of liberal establishment up when those two bloody notices were delivered to them in 2016. But I think it's also has the potential to trip sections of the very online right up, because of the fact that they're really preoccupied with certain things which really don't affect your average voter. That's not to say that the culture wars, we might call it, or wokeness, or any of these issues aren't really important to people. They absolutely are. But there's they're obsessing over specific things. They're exaggerating many things. And they're getting very conspiratorial about certain things as well. And I think they're confusing the dynamism of their own X page with public opinion.
Yeah.
And it's just a dead end, if nothing else. But as you say, there is also this kind of darker side to it, which we should definitely be concerned about. But more than anything, this stuff just looks ridiculous to most people. I think that's been certainly the upshot of this week and all this Taylor Swift stuff.
Definitely. I think some people should just log off for a bit. Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.